Yesterday morning, the phone would not stop ringing. Calls came from current clients, former clients, people not contacted in 3 years, gun store owners, and range officers. Every conversation centered on the same headline. A court ruling had reportedly ended gun permit requirements. Everyone asked the same question. Does the decision really mean what it appears to mean? After spending the last 18 hours reviewing the ruling itself, not news headlines, not online commentary, and not social media discussions, a different picture emerged. The decision is both more significant than many people realize and more complicated than most people expect. The ruling is genuine. It does create major changes for firearm owners throughout the country. However, one critical detail is missing from many reports. The decision does not automatically protect everyone. For many gun owners, failing to take the proper steps during the next 24 to 48 hours could actually create more immediate legal risk than the permit structure that existed before. The court ruled that mandatory carry permit requirements are unconstitutional in a substantial number of jurisdictions. On its face, that sounds like a major victory. Over the long term, many supporters of gun rights view it that way. The problem lies in the period between the court's ruling and the moment individual states officially establish their response. During that interval, people may find themselves operating inside a legal gray area. Anyone who misunderstands where the boundaries currently exist could face serious consequences. This is not simply a story about celebrating a legal win. It is about avoiding mistakes during the transition from one legal framework to another. To understand the situation, it is important to examine what the court actually decided, what it did not decide, and what practical steps must be taken before the next day begins. The broader issue starts with a simple reality. Courts do not implement rulings on their own. Even when a court issues a sweeping decision that invalidates an entire permitting structure, that judgment does not instantly alter what every law enforcement officer in every jurisdiction is enforcing. A delay always exists. Sometimes that delay lasts days, sometimes weeks. In other situations, it can continue for months while governments decide whether to comply, immediately, pursue appeals, or seek additional legal review. That period of uncertainty is often where problems arise. A familiar pattern appears after nearly every major firearms ruling. First, the court releases its decision. Next, gun owners read the headlines. They correctly understand, in a broad constitutional sense, that the previous restriction has been found unconstitutional. Then, many act immediately. Some begin carrying without permits because they believe permits are no longer required. Others transport firearms in ways that were previously prohibited because they heard the restriction had been struck down. Some enter locations that once restricted firearm possession because they assume the ruling removed those limitations. Then enforcement occurs. People may be stopped, cited, or even arrested. In some situations, officers have not yet received updated guidance. In others, the jurisdiction may have requested a stay while pursuing an appeal. There are also states that were not directly affected by the ruling and therefore may not be bound by it. The headline may claim that gun permits are finished. The legal reality is more limited. Permit requirements may be affected only in specific locations, under particular circumstances, and according to a timeline that is still unfolding. Understanding that distinction matters. The difference between knowing exactly what changed and assuming more change than actually did could determine whether someone successfully exercises a newly recognized right or ends up facing criminal charges. The ruling itself is built upon the Supreme Court's decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That landmark 2022 decision established a new constitutional standard. Under that framework, the government must show that a firearm restriction is supported by a historical tradition of firearm regulation before limiting rights protected by the Second Amendment. Before Bruin, courts generally relied on a two-step balancing method that provided governments with considerable flexibility when defending firearm regulations. After Bruin, the burden changed. Governments must now demonstrate that a proposed restriction aligns with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation dating back to the founding era. The current ruling applies the Bruin standard directly to may-issue permit systems. These are systems in which government officials retain discretion to deny a carry permit even when an applicant meets standard qualifications. Such denials can be based on subjective considerations, including whether officials believe the applicant has demonstrated a special need to carry a firearm. The court concluded that may-issue permitting structures lack a historical counterpart within American legal tradition. According to the ruling, jurisdictions at the founding did not require citizens to prove a unique or special need before carrying firearms. Because of that conclusion, the court determined that these may-issue systems cannot survive constitutional review under the Bruin framework. That is what many headlines mean when they declare that gun permits are over. The ruling specifically targets may-issue systems where government authorities decide whether a person's reason for carrying is sufficient. It does not eliminate every permit requirement everywhere. Shall-issue systems remain different. In those systems, authorities must issue permits to applicants who satisfy objective requirements. Those permit structures have not been declared unconstitutional. Constitutional carry, often called permitless carry, already exists in more than 24 states. Following this ruling, the framework now stands on stronger constitutional ground than at any previous point. The question every firearm owner must answer immediately is simple. What type of system exists in your state, and how does this decision affect your particular circumstances? The first priority is identifying your state's precise legal position before taking any action. This is the most important step you can take within the next hour. Before altering the way you carry, before leaving home with a firearm, and before acting on anything mentioned in a headline, you must understand exactly where your state currently stands. At this moment, there are 4 possible scenarios. The first scenario is that your state already recognized constitutional carry before this ruling. More than 24 states already permitted law-abiding citizens to carry without a permit. If you reside in one of those states, your daily situation changes very little. You are already operating under the least restrictive structure. The ruling reinforces the constitutional basis of those rights, but it does not require any modification to your current practices. The second scenario is that your state used a shall-issue permitting system rather than a may-issue structure. In that case, the ruling does not directly eliminate your state's permit requirement. Carry permits remain necessary unless and until state officials formally revise the law through legislative or executive action. The third scenario involves a state that operated under a may-issue system and is directly impacted by this ruling. This is where the greatest transition risk exists. The may-issue framework has been found unconstitutional, but the state has not yet officially adjusted enforcement practices. Officers in the field may continue applying previous rules while government agencies and lawmakers work through the process of responding to the decision. The fourth scenario applies to states that maintained may-issue systems but have either requested or obtained a stay while pursuing an appeal. In that circumstance, the previous rules remain legally enforceable throughout the appeals process. A stay effectively means the ruling has not yet taken effect within that jurisdiction, regardless of how headlines describe the situation. The best place to verify your state's position is the official website of your state attorney general. Review any statements issued within the past 48 hours regarding the ruling and the state's response. Those announcements will clarify which of these situations applies and will determine the appropriate next steps. Another important point concerns existing permits. Some firearm owners have incorrectly concluded that because certain permit requirements were declared unconstitutional, permits already in their possession no longer serve any purpose. As a result, some have considered surrendering those permits or allowing them to expire without renewal. That approach moves in the wrong direction. Even in jurisdictions directly affected by the ruling, an existing permit remains evidence of qualification to carry. It demonstrates successful completion of a background check. It records training requirements that were satisfied. It confirms compliance with the legal standards that existed before the ruling. During the transition period, before a state formally adopts a replacement framework, that permit may serve as valuable documentation during encounters with law enforcement. An officer still applying previous guidance will see a valid permit and have no reason to question the legality of your carry status. An officer working under updated instructions will recognize the permit as proof that you met established qualification standards. Giving up a permit or allowing it to expire during this period removes that documentation precisely when it may be most useful. Keep the permit. If renewal is approaching, renew it. During the transition phase, treat it as a layer of legal protection rather than something made obsolete by the ruling. Another issue requires careful attention. Many people who only saw the headline overlooked it entirely. That issue is the possibility of a stay. A court may strike down a law, but the party that lost the case, usually the state government, can request a stay while pursuing an appeal. A stay functions as a temporary pause. The ruling has been issued, but the state disagrees with the outcome and seeks appellate review. During that process, the state asks the court to keep the previous rule in effect. Courts grant stays with some frequency in major constitutional disputes, particularly when officials argue that immediate implementation could create public safety concerns or administrative disruption. If a stay has been granted in your jurisdiction, the prior permit requirements remain enforceable. That remains true even if the underlying ruling found those requirements unconstitutional. While the stay remains active, enforcement continues under the previous framework. A person stopped for carrying without a permit in a jurisdiction operating under an active stay may point to the ruling, but that does not prevent enforcement. Charges can still be filed, and any legal challenge would have to be resolved later in court. To determine whether a stay exists, begin with your state attorney general's official website. Additional information can often be found through legal news organizations that follow Second Amendment litigation. Resources such as the Firearms Policy Coalition's Legal Updates page and the Second Amendment Foundation's Litigation Tracker frequently publish current information regarding stay requests and court decisions. Do not assume that a stay does not exist simply because it has not appeared in major news coverage. Within the first 48 hours following a ruling of this magnitude, a stay request may already have been filed, even if widespread reporting has not yet occurred. Verify the facts before making any decisions. The next issue is understanding which locations remain prohibited, regardless of this ruling. The concern that stands out most involves a mistake, likely to generate a large number of criminal charges during the weeks and months after this decision. The ruling eliminated May issue permit requirements. It did not remove every restriction tied to specific locations. Rules governing sensitive places represent an entirely different legal issue, and that issue was not addressed by this decision. As a result, even in states directly affected by the ruling, and even in states that move quickly toward constitutional carry in response, certain locations remain off limits for firearm carry. Violations in those places can still result in fully enforceable criminal penalties. Federal buildings remain restricted, courthouses remain restricted, schools and school zones remain restricted, polling places remain restricted, government offices remain restricted. These are location-based limitations, not permit-related requirements. Because of that distinction, the ruling affecting permits has no impact on those restrictions. The most common charge likely to emerge during this transition period will involve individuals who correctly understand that a permit may no longer be required, yet incorrectly conclude that they may carry everywhere. That assumption is wrong. Know the current sensitive place restrictions in your state. Understand the federal location rules that apply nationwide, regardless of state law. Recognize that none of those limitations change because of this ruling. Permit requirements may have expanded carry rights significantly. Restrictions tied to specific locations remain exactly where they stood the day before the decision. The next important step involves documenting your qualifications before carrying under any new framework. Many firearm owners are not thinking about this issue, yet it may provide one of the strongest forms of protection during the transition period. In states where this ruling applies and constitutional carry either exists now or is expected soon, carrying without a permit may become lawful. However, interactions with law enforcement during this adjustment period may still involve questions about legal eligibility. An officer who has not yet received complete guidance from the department may ask you to demonstrate that you are legally qualified to possess and carry a firearm. If you already have a permit, that document serves as proof. Use it as previously discussed. If you do not possess a permit and your state has moved toward constitutional carry, consider gathering records that demonstrate your qualifications. This may include documentation from your most recent background check approval, firearms training certificates, previous permit records, or proof of purchase from a licensed dealer where a background check was required. None of these materials are legally mandated under constitutional carry. Still, keeping them organized and accessible inside your vehicle provides immediate evidence during any encounter that you are a qualified, law-abiding firearm owner. The objective during any law enforcement interaction is to remove uncertainty as quickly as possible. Documents that verify your qualifications help accomplish that goal. Having organized records creates clarity. Simply asking someone to take your word for it does not. The final action is to speak with a gun rights attorney in your state during this week. This recommendation brings together every issue discussed so far. A transition period following a ruling of this magnitude is legally complicated. The relationship between the ruling itself, your state's response, pending appeals, possible stays, sensitive place restrictions, and your own circumstances creates a situation that varies from one person to another. An attorney familiar with gun rights law who has reviewed the ruling and understands current enforcement practices in your state can answer one specific question completely. What does this decision mean for me right now in my state and under my circumstances? The consultation may require 1 to 2 hours of attorney time. At this moment, it may be one of the most valuable investments available because the alternative is relying on headlines, social media discussions, and incomplete information while hoping your interpretation of the transition period is correct. That is often when legal problems occur. People feel most protected precisely when they misunderstand the limits of that protection. Contact an attorney before an issue arises, not afterward. Bringing all 6 actions together one final time. First, determine your state's exact legal status before changing anything about how you carry. Keep your existing permit. During the transition period, it functions as an important layer of legal protection. Understand whether a stay exists in your jurisdiction before relying on the ruling. Remember that location-based restrictions remain unchanged and continue to apply exactly as before. Maintain documentation that demonstrates your qualifications so it is available during any encounter. And consult a gun rights attorney in your state this week before problems develop. This ruling represents a significant victory for Second Amendment rights. The courts have stated clearly and directly that government cannot make the right to carry dependent upon a subjective determination regarding whether a person's reason is sufficient. That principle is important. It carries constitutional weight. It deserves careful understanding. At the same time, a legal victory only provides protection when the transition is handled correctly. History contains many examples of individuals who stood on the correct side of a legal principle, yet found themselves facing criminal charges because they moved too quickly, assumed too much, and failed to take the specific steps necessary during the period between a court ruling and practical implementation. The key is understanding those steps and applying them immediately. If you found this breakdown useful, share it with others who may be affected by the ruling, continue following future developments closely, and stay informed as state responses continue to evolve.